So Facebook has carried through on a threat that many assumed was an empty one. It's a big call. Were you surprised that they actually went through with it?
A little bit. I mean, they clearly had been making noises, sending out notices to users. They were appealing to their base of consumers to let them know what was coming down the pipeline. But that is a very different thing from waking up in the morning and finding that your Facebook feed is not what it once was. You know, my mailbox, my messages are just overwhelmed with what has happened in Australia. And so I think one thing that it highlights is that it's akin to, in many ways, part of our phone network being down. We've come to depend on it for a communication tool, but also for understanding what the news is. And we know that news is not only media news, it is also the Bureau of Meteorology or fire services or university articles, whatever. Now, I suspect that Facebook might not have meant to take down quite so many pages as it did. Possibly it was intentional. But because I don't think it's done this on such a large scale across an entire country before, it is also possible that they have accidentally scooped up in their net a set of sites that they may not have intended to do.
Well, Facebook hasn't exactly been doing very well in the court of public opinion in recent times. Moving to block access to some of the sites you were just mentioning there certainly won't help.
No, and I think part of the problem is that while Facebook and Google can alert their consumers, oh, you should know this is happening, it's a big threat, you know, we're thinking about drawing this line in the sand, we're planning on not carrying content. The jump to this sort of whole nother plane might have engendered more public support if they had been more forthright with people early on about the fact that while you were getting to use a free product, you were the product. Your metadata was being scraped and used and sold, not your personal data, but access to you in a very specialized, micro-targeted way was being sold to advertisers, and Facebook, has made a lot of money out of it, as has Google. And they have, over the last few years, made various ways for people to improve their privacy, but really fundamentally, it has not allowed people to have a total out of that. And as consumers have become more and more aware that they are the product, they're a bit wary and untrusting of the big tech companies. And so there's a need to restore some of that trust. If they had been more forthright, if they'd given people more consumer options, they might have found there was more groundswell of support than there is today.
Is it over the top to say that this is an attack on Australian democracy, or is there real credit in that argument? Because it will mean, won't it, that fake news will spread much more easily?
So, is an attack on Australian democracy? I think it is a big dent in the infrastructure that allows us to communicate in an open and free society. Yes, that it definitely is. I mean, it is important to allow free market systems enough so that people can innovate with technology, and people will invest in doing so. You want to do that. But at the end of the day, news media is a public good. I mean, it's not just media companies for money. Obviously, they are, organizations that are profit-based organizations in many cases, but they do have this public service. And it's kind of different from a lot of other markets because of that. So denying us access to it is, as I said, a little bit like saying, wake up in the morning and saying, I don't have mobile phone coverage anymore. You're kind of missing this essential service. Now, the good news is it did sound from the statement this morning as though the federal treasurer had discussions with Mark Zuckerberg, and they were progressing, and there were only, he said, I think, a few particular areas that they still had to resolve. But in the meantime, we are kind of wondering, wow, can we really do without Facebook? It is interesting that Google has kind of cut Facebook loose. So the two of them, were standing in a sense as a pair, strong on this issue. And now Google has gone off at the 23rd hour and go, actually, I'll sign arrangements with the media. Whereas Facebook is sort of stand firm on, we won't be pushed around. Internationally, Facebook obviously is going to be drawing attention to Australia because of its decision, but it's also been making decisions internationally in other countries, in Brazil, in Canada, in Indonesia, It has just in the last week said that it's going to be reducing the amount of political information news broadcast on its site because people in those countries depend on it very highly for political news, and they want to kind of tone that down a little bit, they said. So there's an international trend happening here of Facebook kind of, in a sense, closing off some of the access to information we've always assumed we freely had through Facebook.
But Australia is really out in front here in terms of legislating the sort of changes the government is pushing for, isn't it? And it's been interesting to see the reaction overseas to that, particularly as you alluded to in the US, which from a government level has really been trying to convince the Australian government not to go down that path in such strong terms.
Yes, I mean, so there is a divergence of interests happening right there. I mean, the US is a close ally, obviously, of Australia, but the US government is looking after one of its largest companies, and Australia is saying, well, we have to look after our own domestic media. So there is definitely a divergence there. I guess it depends on whether or not you consider access to lots of different media sources an essential service. And also whether you think that there's too much dominance in this particular feed market, if you will, information feed market. And that's really what the ACCC had been indicating in its interim report that came out in January was, this market dominance was a problem and needed to be addressed.
Dr. Soulett-Dreyfus, always appreciate your analysis on all these tech issues. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.